This interview that I'm having with Matt on March 24th, and I'm just so excited that he's here to be able to talk with us and to be able to explain a little bit about his observations from his time. Now, Matt, you were in Honduras. Can you give us some years and can you share with us what your goal was when you first came here and what it transformed into?
Okay. After I got out of college and married, I knew that I wanted to go to the mission field. And so I was only 23 when the first opportunity arose. So this was back in 1991, and we landed in La Ceiba en route to the Mosquito Coast in January of 1992. Our home church was aware of a missionary lady, an elderly missionary lady working with the Miskito Indians that was needing help in all sorts of things, anything from evangelism, some pastor training. They had an old shortwave radio station. So initially, we just wanted to go and help and learn. I knew I loved already living around other cultures. I had studied anthropology quite a bit in college and was just anxious to get into a village situation and begin to see what the gospel could do. And that all began with the Miskito Indians. We were with them for about 4 years, from 1992 to 1996. And we basically just plugged away in those basic areas of ministry, radio station, evangelism, and Bible teaching, training of potential pastors.
Did you comment on what made you interested? Why Honduras?
Well, it was just an opportunity initially. There was never a point in my life where I said, oh, I really want to go to Honduras. Because of some previous exposure to Honduras, a short-term trip to a region, well, a little town called Teopacente, when there were Nicaraguan refugees there. That was back in '86. I had some exposure, but I was willing to go anywhere in the world. It was just the first opportunity that presented itself. And I was a simple enough guy, my wife too, we were just simple enough to say, hey, works for us. It's an opportunity. Let's do this.
That's awesome. What were some first impressions of the Mosquito people group when you came there?
Um, the Miskito Indians are somewhat typical of a lot of indigenous groups that are being slowly assimilated into the cultures that are around them. Specifically, I was impressed with the fact that they seemed a little timid. They seemed a bit private, took some effort to win trust. They obviously had had some bad experiences in the past by opening up their lands and their hearts to foreigners. Although they did have a certain affinity to white people, perhaps because of their history, where back when the Spaniards were colonizing Central America, the Miskito Indians were rebels and aligned themselves with the British buccaneers, the pirates. And it was kind of an area of resistance. So, some of their language, has English words, about 10% there. And so they have a certain affinity toward those of us that are white. But still, they'd been burned enough times. So let's see, there was one other thing I was going to mention. The Miskito Indians, the other thing that I remember about them initially is that they were very religious, but it was also very evident that their religion was very animistic, in the sense that they had been mixing Christianity with animism for a lot of years. And so that stood out from the very start.
Ooh, maybe into that religion aspect later on, because that's one of the
Yeah, we
things
could
that
go
they're
into that later.
studying. Is there's a couple of different theories on why or what makes a religion, and why religions become such a dominant part of people's lifestyle and people's worldview. But let's come back to that possibly. What
Okay.
about the Garifuna people? When you first encountered them, what were some first impressions?
So the first impression was that we had entered to a very contrasting culture, because the Garifunas are very outgoing, very gregarious, and very happy, and not reserved at all. Their emotions are readily apparent, whatever they may be. Very social. They would walk right into our house, uh, just stirring up a conversation. They just love to socialize. Um, Although they have some very secretive sides to them, I think every people group does. Generally speaking, they were a very, very outgoing culture. And interestingly enough, to get back to later, their animistic beliefs are arguably even stronger than the Miskito Indians, and how they integrated that into certain forms of Christianity.
That's really neat. Thank you for sharing your first impressions. We learned in psychology last year that first impressions are very strong, and they're difficult to overcome, but that doesn't mean that they can't be overcome, because the longer you spend with people, the more you actually get to develop a lasting impression of who they are. So sorry, students, I'm bringing up psychology. I taught these same students last year for psychology. Out of those, I gave you several topics on normative behaviors, on religion, on family structure, on what you saw in the house and what types of structures they were, on food and agriculture, on clothes, and on social justice. Do any of those you really want to discuss for either of the people groups?
Oh, they're all interesting for both people groups. So, boy, just to choose a couple would be hard. Are there particular ones that you would like to focus on, knowing that would more benefit your class, or do you want to spread them up between the two cultures? I'm happy to go in any direction here.
Well, let's definitely talk about the religion aspect. Now, probably about half of our students here at our school are Catholic, and the other half are Protestant evangelical.
Mhm.
And so it's always interesting in theology classes, trying to show that we have a lot in common, but then to move to more of an indigenous setting where there's obviously a clear syncretism, there's the proper word,
Yeah.
where when Christianity came, it basically got absorbed into the current religion as opposed to totally transforming a people group, what a lot of our students are showing with their lives.
Mhm.
So, what sort of religions did you observe? And um, would you say that there were more materials that demonstrated the religion, which is one of our theories, that the materials, we see a religion through the materials represented. For example, in Protestantism and Catholicism, we have the cross, and that's one of the main icons that we use. But
Mhm.
there's a lot of other icons that are found within Christianity as well. But then our other theory is that it's not necessarily what you see, but the practices that you see observed that help to show what sort of religion they actually do follow. Uh, so one would focus on the objects, the other would focus on the actions. Um,
Mhm.
which which would you say out of those, and you're welcome to pick both, is a better representation of what you saw, either objects or the actions themselves?
I think in both cases, the actions, because there's very little in the way of objects involved, except the exception there may be the way the Miskito Indians copied exactly the Moravian style church buildings. So that was standard throughout the Miskito world. Even in some cases, the other denominations like the Church of God or the Adventists, that initial contact with the Moravians really set certain structures in motion, but they don't have a lot of symbolism. Some churches don't even have crosses hanging in them amongst the Miskito Indians.
Can you give us an example of social behaviors that you then observe, religious social behaviors, and maybe what you think that they meant in both people groups?
Well, with the Miskito Indians, there's a tremendous emphasis within at least the Christian forms of religion, the singing of hymns. They didn't have a lot of native music, more just kind of chant and storying. And so they were very much attracted to the music that the Moravians brought in, and entire hymnals were translated. And those hundreds of hymns continue to be sung and often memorized to this day. In terms of other practices, they picked up just pretty typical preaching, evangelistic kinds of preaching. I would say that the religious forms that the Miskito Indians picked up, which revolved around church in a building, did not always translate into changes at home. It's almost like a hat that they would put on Sunday and then take off as they would move out of the building, and then continue on with their typical Miskito cultures or cultural activities and beliefs once they got back to their homes.
Excellent. I would love to hear about the Garifuna people next and your observations on religion from them. But what language does the Miskito indigenous group speak?
That was a little garbled. Could you repeat that?
Sure, absolutely. What's the language spoken by most Miskito Indians?
They just call it Miskito, Miskito.
Okay. And were the hymns then sung in Spanish or Miskito?
Actually, the initial Moravian missionaries learned the language very, very well, very fluently, and all of those hymns are sung in the Miskito language.
Oh, that's wonderful. Your observations of religious practices in the Garifuna people group that you were with.
Okay, the Garifunas identified more with the Catholic missionaries. So whereas most of the Miskito Indians would identify themselves as Moravians, most of the Garifunas would identify themselves as Catholics. And so there were a lot of typical building structures and decorations in the Catholic churches that were there. But in terms of behavior, the religious beliefs of the Garifunas, which has much to do with ancestral worship or ancestral appeasement, that was never shaken or deviated from. There was a lot of syncretism between those animistic beliefs and the Catholic Church. And one of the most common Garifuna religious practices, if you would, was the practice of the which is usually initiated by a local witch doctor, a local medium, one that's in contact with the spirits. And he would, through his contact with the spirits, notify any given family of the discontent of their deceased relative and the necessary appeasement that he would require to alleviate any wrath that he might bring upon the family and thus the village. The family would then be responsible to do a very large celebration, usually community-wide celebration, where delegation of cooking responsibilities between the ladies and the men would bring the alcohol, and they would have an all-night celebration of this particular relative. A certain amount of the food would either be buried or thrown into the ocean. Alcohol would be poured out on the ground, soaked up into the sand. It would be referenced that obviously such and such relative, let's call him, Uncle Henry, was very thirsty. He, drank the whole bottle of rum or whatever. Food would be left out in his old bedroom, things like that. And hopefully he would be satisfied by the honor and food that was presented, and any wrath would be then appeased, and the whole town would get a very rambunctious celebration. A lot of alcohol, a lot of food, a lot of dancing. They get out their drums, dance the night away to heavy beats. The Garifunas utilized their punta dancing and at these celebrations, and it was actually one of the main times that they would use it. Not that they would need an excuse for their dancing, but these kinds of things would happen several times a year in any given community, and was one of the most outstanding forms of their belief in the spiritual realm and how they would, relate to that realm.
That's really neat. You covered several different sections too, what we've been discussing. We talked about magic, we talked about witchcraft, we talked about sorcery and elements in a lot of different religions. So it's nice that you were able to then bring up with the Garifuna people group that there are still those aspects within their culture and that they're thriving, especially in the form of that ceremony we discussed.
Yes, very much so. Yeah, these local witch doctors are very prominent members of the community. They are visited, accessed for healing or curses, or even different kinds of poisons when you want to do harm to your enemy. These practices are quiet but extremely active even to this day.
Well, that's very interesting. So there were several other categories. Did any of those pique your interest? We talked about normative behaviors that you observe, things that you should or should not do in that people group, or how the family structures were structured, like who gets to make the decisions of the family, or
Yeah,
there were a lot of different choices.
there are. Let me mention that both the Miskito and the Garifuna people tend to be matrilocal.
Oh, that's
So
interesting. We don't see very many native, or rather, cultures in this hemisphere that are metrolocal.
yeah, the ladies stick together to, cover the chores at home and within the villages. Yeah, the men tend to, it's not a hard, fast rule, but they tend to move to, the region that the women are from, because the women's ties, both with the Miskitos and the Garifunas, they hold the communities together. In the case of the Garifunas, they're out fishing or traveling the world, or in previous eras, they were involved in warfare. The Miskito Indians, more recently, the men are involved in diving or the agriculture. So the women hold the society, the local society together. And quietly make a lot of the decisions, although the men, when they come back to town or are in town, like to think they're in charge.
So it's a patriarchy really run by a patriarchy.
Yeah, yeah, there's some debate or some tension there. But yeah, the gals are used to the guys either being out of town or busy, so they make a lot of the day-to-day decisions.
That's interesting. So why marriage then? Is marriage common? Is there a ceremony that's usually done? Why would people choose to get married then?
Now, the Moravians have influenced the Miskito Indians for, at least on the Honduras side, close to 150 years. So marriage was a practice that was introduced and embraced. I'm not sure how much marrying went on before that.
You mean from a
So
legal standpoint or from a religious standpoint?
I missed the first part of that. Sorry.
Do you mean from like a legal standpoint where there's uh like maybe that practice existed in that village, or did the religious when the Moravians came in, did they introduce the religious aspect of marriage, that there's more of a spiritual dimension to marriage?
Yeah, they did introduce the spiritual dimension um, and the ceremony. Um, but interestingly enough, again, the culture tends to win out. Just to be frank about, a lot of these communities, you may introduce religion on one form or another, but culture is powerful, and those mindsets are not easily transformed. So the Miskito men, though they be married, are often unfaithful to their wives, both quietly and not so quietly. Whereas the Garifunas tend to simply not marry. They just shack up for a few years. When that gets uncomfortable, they just move on. A lot less marriage amongst the Garifunas. Um, so there's just a recognition that there's a certain amount of commitment, that you may have children together, but they are very quick, both men and women, to move on when conflict erupts.
So then marriage would be either a religious ceremony for show, or marriage would be to promote offspring.
Yeah, all men and women amongst the Miskitos and the Garifunas, they're all interested in the largest number of offspring they can manage. That's help in whether that's farming or fishing. There's a certain amount of prestige. And there's also a sense that that is their, if you would, from an American perspective, a social security system. Your only hope of being cared for well when you are old and infirmed is to have enough children that have grown up and either become professionals or have enough resources to take care of you well when you're old. And there's very much a sense that they want to hedge their bets in their elderly years by having as many children that could combine their resources to take care of you well. So they have a lot of ideas why they want a lot of children, but they're not necessarily strict on making sure that's through the same husband and wife.
Yeah. And we saw a large number of offspring in pre-industrialized America as well, where you just have to have them because of the type of farming that you did, or the type of work just required a lot of offspring, that you're right, it was a social security thing to have people to care for you in your old age. And we saw that kind of burn off in the 1900s, and especially in the late 1950s, 60s,
Yeah.
As with almost a post-industrialized society, now we're almost limited in the amount of population that we can offer to be able to have
Yeah.
a quality life. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's
Agreed.
Um, I only had a couple more questions, but if you were really interested in any of those other topics, um, I would love to come back around as soon as we finish, back to one of those. But I wanted to talk about when you initially came or when you go to um, another, we call them others because they're not of our own culture. Um,
Mhm.
how hard was it to come as a learner, and how long did it take for them to accept you as a learner and to build that trust?
Mm. Well, perhaps because of some of my reading and a little bit of training before I came to the mission field, I was already in the mindset of the need to be a learner, at least initially. Um, had read up on some of the pitfalls of trying to move into an area and instantly become either an expert or a teacher to others before you had won any trust. It's not something that's easily assumed. So when I did come in, and I was usually a learner in terms of language, I was very honest, hiring, tutors and desiring to learn local language, desiring to learn about local customs, even um, the ministry aspects of what we were doing. We always did it in association with other um, local believers. It was always um, some form of cooperative discipleship going on where I wouldn't just be a preacher, but I was teaching someone to preach. So, um, having said that, I just can't imagine doing it any other way. I've seen evidence of others not coming from a position of humility, and they're going to run into some significant troubles, or they're going to run into very closed hearts. But where you're humble and you are learning, you're not only gaining tremendous amount of information that you need, but it endears people to you very quickly. It makes friendships so much easier, cooperation so much easier. I just, again, can't imagine doing it any other way. To this day, my best friends in the world have come through these experiences, these missionary experiences now in 4 different cultures around the world, 2 specifically to Honduras. But I have one particular Miskito Indian, one particular Garifuna man that, particularly when we were living in the same communities, we literally would have given our lives for each other. The bond was so strong, the trust was so deep, um, not only because of taking a position of humility and respect with each other, but we had the bond of Christ, which is no small thing. We both had a relationship with our Creator and our Savior, and we shared a tremendous amount of fellowship, because of that.
No, that's neat. Thank you for
I'm not
sharing
getting, I'm
that.
sure if I'm getting to the full answer to your question,
No, no,
but
you did. No, I appreciate it. And then final question, and then if you have any questions that I should have, oh, actually, this question is, what questions should I have asked that you think it would be helpful for understanding these two people that you were able to spend time with? What questions should I have asked that I didn't ask? And what would be your answers to those questions?
concerning your sociology class, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Um,
Well, and the reason is there's a large chunk of our benchmarks for this class.
mhm.
The Honduran government, thankfully, adds in, okay, that's great, you're teaching all these different things now. What about Honduras? How does this apply directly to our life in Honduras? So if I was looking at these benchmarks right here for there's a large number of them where I'm supposed to um, for example, acquire feelings of solidarity for projects of various social, gender, and ethnic groups, particularly those within Honduras. So they always add in these extra benchmarks to say, okay, that's great that you're learning about it from, for example, an American perspective.
Mhm.
But what do you do with that here in Honduras? How can we keep these students active as citizens of Honduras, helping and aiding people in their own country?
Okay. Well, I appreciated the last question, how social justice has helped or hurt um, within these people groups in the last 50 or so years. I'll just use that as a launching point because, most, well, many societies around the world are mixed societies. Honduras is no exception, although it's, completely dominated politically and commercially, socially by the mestizo population, the Hispanic population. I'm forgetting the exact number of indigenous groups, like 7, I believe, within Honduras, 2 of which I've worked with personally. And I've watched the tragedy over the years of not just how these different ethnic groups treat each other in Honduras, but around the world. So this isn't specific to just Honduras, but I do believe that it's something that needs to be brought up. And that is, in general terms, how we tend to be ethnocentristic, or, we tend to focus on our own culture and prioritize and honor our own culture. We promote our own culture within politics, even within church, quite often. And I've watched a tremendous amount of just open discrimination against the Miskito Indians and the Garifunas. They've been a part of this nation since, well, the Miskitos are indigenous to the area. The Garifunas, came somewhere around the time the Spaniards had. So they have as much right to be there as anyone else. And yet the discrimination, the inequities, the injustices that they live with on a daily basis are significant, to say the least. We can take the obvious example of the Miskito Indians that live out in the Departamento Gracias a Dios. So they have their own state, if you would, where they by and large manage it because they are the majority population. They have representatives in their Congress. They have a governor, and yet perpetually they have no medicine in their pharmacies, and the social system for medicine, schooling, education. They're always getting just the dregs of what Tegucigalpa sends their direction. And it's both institutionalized and within the culture. There's a sense within the society that these cultures are inferior, less intelligent, less capable. And it's been really tough to swallow over the years to see how they're treated practically, institutionally. A good friend of mine was actually the governor of the Departamento Gracias a Dios for 4 years, and was all excited about, doing neat things for helping this truly underdeveloped corner of a relatively underdeveloped country. And when he got to Tegucigalpa, was just literally completely shut out from having a voice, from having resources. I can't even go into all the details of what he shared with me, but he was basically just told to kick back for the next 4 years and get whatever crumbs from the table, they tossed his direction. And so whether you're out in the middle of a Miskito village and you just never see medicine, never see aid reach those corners of the world, when there's natural disasters, they pay their sales tax like everybody else. But anyway, that's challenging. Whether you're talking about tribal warfare in Africa, or you're talking about discrimination, whether that's the United States, Mexico, that has a lot of different ethnic groups where I've lived as well, or Honduras. Just the general tension between the ethnic groups and how that relates to specific discriminatory practices is just one of the most difficult aspects of my Honduran experience.
Yeah, for sure.
Similar things happen amongst the Garifunas, but the Garifunas that come from a more warrior mentality, they're survivors. They have forged paths into medicine and to some degree politics. They've been more successful at fighting through the discrimination and carving out a little corner of the community and claiming a voice for themselves and influencing with their very strong culture, their music, their foods. They've been a little more successful carving out a corner of the world for themselves, largely because, in part, because they have so many of their peers and family members in the United States that help support them back at home. But the Miskito Indians have been far less successful in holding off both, the discrimination and recently even land grabs and things. But those are whole other subjects.
No, in the time that you were working with these groups as well for a good 25, 30 years, did you see any positive social justice movements?
I saw a few novel attempts, nothing that was very significant. There was one effort made to introduce bilingual education. I had a friend involved in writing textbooks. He was fluent. He was initially a missionary, married a Miskito woman, became completely fluent in the language, lived most all of his life amongst the Miskito Indians, was involved in the creation of some bilingual educational materials. Those programs were started, never truly finished. They published some things that are still available. So most things only last as long as the political cycle, and 4 years go by, there's, a whole new set of governing officers, and they're not interested in extending the last season's efforts. So that's the only one that comes initially to mind, at least that it has to do with, more formal institutions.
Yeah, no, based off the limited time that I've been here, I could see that happening, especially like we had the mobile hospitals that were brought, but they only brought in a certain number of them, and then most of them never really traveled to the areas where they actually were needed. They ended up being in convenient spots, not convenient though for everyone who needed them, but convenient for access for, I don't know, government officials to be able to observe, which means that it had to be close to the capital.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, I do really thank you for your time. As we're studying these things, it's just really neat to hear. In fact, they were required to go find someone that worked or knew somebody in that field, and so this was a good opportunity for some of them, especially with those people groups, being on the border. And maybe they don't have access to knowing somebody that has had firsthand experience or
Mhm.
is part of those indigenous groups, able to have time to get these questions answered. So I really enjoy
I'm
your time.
really glad to be able to engage in this conversation, really glad to participate in your class and offer a little something. It's a bit of a unique perspective, perhaps, but um, it was an honor to be asked to speak on these subjects. I'm glad someone is asking these questions. I appreciate it.